By the mid-1960s, demonstrations calling for voting rights for Black people were proliferating all over the South. It was March of 1965, and we were juniors at Agnes Scott College. We were just back from spring vacation, having watched way more television at home than we ever did at Agnes Scott, where TV sets were pretty much limited to dormitory common areas. We were mesmerized by the coverage of thousands of Black activists and their white supporters marching in Alabama, many of them coming in from northern cities. My friend Mary Brown Bullock and I sat in the hub, which was then the Student Activities Building, talking about what we had seen over the last couple of weeks. Terrible scenes of dogs being set on marchers, and marchers, both men and women, being beaten bloody with clubs and whips. We were very attuned to the civil rights movement at Agnes Scott. Being located in Atlanta, the home of Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I remember that Andy Young and Coretta Scott King both spoke on campus to groups of students. We didn't have any African-American students at Agnes Scott in 1965, but we did have an exchange program with Spelman College, where I participated for a week. I remember Mary saying to me on that March evening, how would we ever be able to explain to our children that we were this close and we didn't join in the march? Mary and I had no way to get to Montgomery, but we soon joined up with two seniors, one of whom had a car. So the four of us hatched a plot to go to Montgomery the next day, March 25th, to join in the last day of the march, when the marchers would reach the Alabama Capitol. Now, in those days, you didn't just walk off the Agnes Scott campus. You had to sign off with the dean's office, saying where you were going and why. So the four of us slipped one by one into the dean's office and signed off for a meeting off campus or some other euphemism. The next morning, we got up very early and dressed carefully. You see, lots of people in the South were just writing off the increasing civil rights protests as being the efforts of so-called outside agitators from the North. So it was very important to us. In fact, it was one of our primary motivations for going to Montgomery in the first place, that we make the point that it was their sons and daughters, like us, who were passionately supporting the civil rights movement. We wanted the people who saw us to recognize us as their own. So we dressed in what was then the Southern College girls' uniform, a villager dress, Weegian loafers, and a London Fog raincoat, and off we went. I remember that it was a cloudy day that felt almost ominous. We were excited, but I for sure was also apprehensive and a little bit frightened. You couldn't have seen all those television images from the past two marches without expecting that there might be similar violence, in spite of the fact that by the day that we went, President Johnson had mobilized at last federal marshals to protect the marchers. As we marched into downtown Montgomery and down that long avenue leading to the Alabama Capitol building, we expected to hear jeers and taunts from the sidewalks, or possibly much worse. Mary remembers that Black men held hands and formed protective barriers on either side of the marchers, and that we were carefully placed in the middle of our row with protected marchers on either side. But as we entered the downtown area, we encountered an eerie silence. Window shades were drawn, and there was nobody on the sidewalks. It was as though Montgomery just turned its back on us, refusing to acknowledge our presence, much less our message. The atmosphere was almost festive at some times. Marching along with us were celebrities and stars: Joan Baez, Peter, Paul and Mary, Harry Belafonte. I'm sure there are many other celebrities that we didn't see or recognize. As the speeches in front of the Capitol building wore on and the afternoon got later, we became apprehensive about getting back to our car and back to Atlanta. My parents certainly didn't know where I was, and they hadn't given their permission for me to be there, as required by the college. And those eerily quiet streets around the Capitol started to seem more and more ominous as we walked back to the car. 5 months later, on August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'd like to think that we four scared but also enthusiastic and passionate college students from Agnes Scott made a tiny contribution to that effort on that March day almost 56 years ago. Today, in 2021, voting rights are once again under attack. Let us all, once again, commit to do everything in our power to assure that everyone, every American, has the right to cast their vote in a free and fair election.